All right. Well, today is the fourth part, the final part of a series called All the Things You Don't Have to Do for God to Be Good with You. You would not believe how many people have told me over the last 4 weeks how much that song makes them want to dance. But it's the last week with that song, unfortunately. Anyway, so we're in the fourth part of a series. If you're new here, if this is your first week here, we're glad that you're here. But it might feel a little bit like you're coming in at the end of the movie. So we'll bring you up to speed real quick. And if you've been here throughout the whole thing, this might just be a little refresher for you, all right? We're talking about all the things, all the things. Now, when I say all the things, what I'm talking about is the rules and regulations that come with religion. All the things, like the God says, the to-dos and the to-don'ts, the Bible says, the Jesus says, the this verse says, everything that feels like a command, an instruction, a directive. We're talking about those things and trying to understand them in context. Now, a lot of us were introduced to all those things at the same time we were introduced to God. And so God became like inseparably connected to all the things. And if you're not careful, God may have or could become really just this cosmic rule giver who's making sure people don't color outside the lines, don't break the rules, or he's gonna get you, right? And so what I've asked you to do over the last few weeks is to try and, especially if you're new to church, to try and set aside how you have come to understand all the instructions and commands that Jesus has given, or that God has given, or that we read in Scripture. And try to set aside that with all those emotions and consider rebuilding an understanding of the place of these commands, to understand them in context as they were meant to be understood. So on week one, the question we asked really with all these commands and instruction was why? Like, what's the motive? I don't know about you, but for me, when someone tells me to do something, my natural way of responding is to just ask why. Like, what's the motive? Who says? And what's the deal here? What's driving this? And to make a long story short, on week one, what we got down to is that you are the motive. Like, your good, your well-being is the motive behind all of these commands. The way Jesus explained it, the way followers of Jesus after him explained it, even as far back as Moses, like a really long time ago, the way all of this was set up is that there is a God who is deeply concerned for your well-being, and that's the motive behind all of this. That's what's driving this. And so, like, doing these things, listening to God, it's not about doing the right thing or like checking the box. What if it's not the right thing to do? What if it really is, genuinely is the best thing for you? Like, imagine how that would change the way that things hit emotionally when we heard those instructions. And so maybe you were with us for the first time that week and you're like, all right, cool. Well, all of this is for my good, so I'm gonna try to do all the things. And maybe real quick, that got a little overwhelming because there's a lot of them, right? Maybe you have a book like this, a Bible like this somewhere in your house. Maybe it's a little bigger than this. And maybe it feels like there's a lot going on in there. So if you're like me, again, I'm like, okay, can I just have a model? Can someone show me what it looks like? Can we sum it up somehow? And fortunately, I think Jesus knew our limitations and gave us a really easy way to sum this up. And it's not easy to carry out, but it's easy to understand. It's clear. And what he said, if you're wondering, like, what does it look like to get this right? Really, all you need to ask in any given situation, what it looks like, well, the question really should be, what does love look like? Jesus said all of this, all of these commands, from beginning to end, all of them hang on this idea of love. Jesus said, a new command I give you, like one to his followers. Love one another as I have loved you. Like, this is the whole thing. In any given situation, you try to do that and you are pointed in the right direction. Some people would even say all of this is just a detailed articulation of how to love one another. So then maybe you got to that point, you're like, okay, well, the motive is our good. Like, if the one thing the one thing that really captures all the things is love, right? Then the next question was, well, all right, so if this is for my good, that's good, right? If it looks like love, that's good. But let's be honest, there are some days where I'm just like not really feeling it. You know, I make choices that are bad for me all the time. And so then what are the consequences for breaking the rules? You know, like, is it all good until you step outside the lines? Like, is it okay until you break the rules? Is that when God drops the hammer? And last week we looked at the words of James, who was a brother of Jesus, and he explained this whole idea. Like, God isn't just telling you these things for the sake of telling you these things. When you choose to go the other direction, it may lead you down a path that you don't want to go. He said eventually it's like a process that ends in pain and disappointment. In other words, when you think about God and breaking the rules, it's not God who's going to get you with the hammer. It's God who's trying to stop you from getting hit with the hammer. You know, God is not going to remove the intimacy from your relationships because you lied. But he knows that lying breaks trust in a relationship. And where there's no trust, you can't have intimacy. And so he says, don't lie, right? He's trying to prevent you from the pain, experiencing the pain and disappointment. And so if on that week we asked what happens when we break the rules, this week the question we're asking is, what happens when they break the rules? The other people in my life. How am I supposed to feel about their behavior when I don't agree with it? Those friends that I have that do things that maybe at one point I did, but now I choose not to do. How am I supposed to treat them? And how am I supposed to act around them? You know, it's interesting. If you Google the term judgmental hypocrite, the things that you'll find, the links that come up are almost exclusively about religious people, about the church, about Christianity. This has become a term that's used primarily to describe people in the church. Hypocrites, meaning like they say one thing, but they actually do another, and judgmental because they or we feel the responsibility of policing the behavior of the world. We've got beliefs, and we need to let everybody know how we feel about their conduct. Or at least this is what's explained when you dig into this a little bit. Like, why does the church have a reputation of being judgmental and hypocritical? When I was growing up, this is what I didn't want to be. And whenever I considered getting more involved in the church or buying into this or believing this, this is the thing I was afraid I was supposed to become. In fact, when I was in school, I had friends. Some were people of faith. Surprise, I did have friends. Some were people of faith, and then others weren't, right? And there were the people who weren't, and they were kind of fun to hang out with. They just let me be me. And then a lot of those people in the religious group, I felt like I had to be something else around them. And this group, the religious group, wasn't really cool with the people who didn't do the things that they thought they were supposed to be doing. And so there was this divide between them. Now, I went to school with my cousin. He was 4 years older than me. His name's Dan. And I knew he believed what I believed. He was a follower of Jesus. He was on board with this, in fact, way more than I was. And yet there was something different about him. He was cool with the church people, but he was also loved by the people who weren't church people. And it was because he didn't judge them. And I remember wondering how he got away with this. Where does this fit into the whole idea of Christianity? My sister and I would actually talk about him at home, and we'd say if we're gonna be Christians, we wanna be cool Christians like Dan, because everybody's cool with him. and he doesn't feel the need to police the world. But then as I got a little bit older, like he would come to mind, and the way he lived came to mind. And the thing that I would try and figure out is, okay, is he just making up his own brand, his own version of Christianity? Or is he on to something here? Like, which picture, the religious group that judged everyone, or the guy who didn't, which one is more like what Jesus wanted from his followers? And that's the question we're gonna look at today in the time that we have left. Like, maybe you are thinking about buying into all this. Like, maybe you're like, okay, this is starting to make sense. Jesus seems real to me. There's something to this. But maybe in the back of your mind, there's that question, like, is this what I'm gonna have to become then? Like, what do I do with the people that I live with that don't do what I do now? And how do I interact with them? Do I have to become judgmental? Or is there another road? There's a letter in the New Testament. It's called 1 Corinthians. There's another one after. It's called 2 Corinthians. It was written by Paul, who came after Jesus. Is also known as St. Paul, like St. Paul's Cathedral, right? And Paul started a lot of churches, and then he would write letters to them to kind of check in on them. Now, the church in Corinth was just bananas. Like, they did crazy things in that church. Pretty quickly, that church started in a good place and went to a bad place. And so this letter is the most intense letter that we have in the New Testament. Like, he is coming in hot with this letter. He's upset with them. The stuff they're doing is off the wall. They pretty quickly had some sharp divisions in that church. There were people who were pushed out of certain meetings because of their social status, like how much money they had. They were competitive in religious things. They were pretending to be spiritual. There was all sorts of craziness happening in this church. And there's even this one situation where there's a man who is sleeping with his father's wife. Now, if you want, like real quick, you can just draw a family tree mentally and think about what that connection looks like. This could be that the guy is sleeping with his mom, or it could be his stepmom. We don't know for sure. We're just told he's sleeping with his father's wife. Either way, that's a pretty messed up thing to do. His dad's probably not cool with it. And yet in the church, nobody cares. Paul says, like, you're bragging about it. You're boasting about it. Like, they're handling things totally wrong. So he comes in hot. Like, if you're looking for a letter that's really gonna like come down, there's a big hammer in this letter. And so he comes in, right? And he's writing here with all this emotion. And he says, I told you when I was with you not to associate with people who are doing certain things, not to live in a way that shows approval of certain things. And then in the middle of all his emotion, he stops, as if to clarify. And this for me was just crazy. He stops and he says, well, not at all, meaning the people of this world. Now, he's not like bringing Martians and aliens into the discussion here. He's referencing this common teaching of Jesus, where Jesus would talk about like an identity being in the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And then there's like the kingdom of this world, like the average person, right? He's saying there's a way to do things under the reign of God, and then there's a way that like normal people operate. He's like, I'm not talking about the way most people operate. That's not what I'm talking about. In other words, like the person that you work with, the person you go to school with, the mom at the bus stop, your coworker, your uncle's neighbor, your friend, your whoever, all the little groups. He's like, I'm not talking about those people. That's not what I'm talking about. If you're wondering, like the people outside of the church, he's not talking about those people. And then he stops and he asks this question. And I remember exactly where I was when I read this. I couldn't believe that this was in the Bible. In fact, I was like sitting down in my little college room. I was sitting on this couch that was given to me for free by a bartender that I worked with. And I actually stopped reading and stepped back when I read these next words. He says this: what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is none. When I read that for the first time, I was like, there's no way. There's no way that means what it sounds like. That he's saying, people of faith should not judge the behavior of people who don't believe what they believe. That to me blew my mind. Like how then did the church as a whole get a reputation of being judgmental by those on the outside if he's saying the church has no business? Like Paul, this is the Christianest Christian that there's ever been. If like Christianity is a cereal box, he's on the cover. And he's like, no, it's not my business to judge people who don't believe. And this makes sense. Like if you think about the logic behind this, we've talked about it before. When it comes to following Jesus, there's a process that happens. It starts with knowing, right? And this is how it works in all our relationships. We get to know someone, and then we begin to trust them. And then when that trust develops, then we begin to listen to them or obey them. And he's like, if you're judging someone who doesn't know God like you do, who doesn't trust him like you do, you're skipping the whole process that you went through. The question to ask is, like, before you say anything about anyone else's behavior, the question is this person with their faith where I am with my faith? Or is it simply, like, an appropriate response often is simply, that's not my business. So, in other words, like, if, let's say you've got a group of friends, okay, and maybe you used to do things with this group of friends, and maybe lately you've decided, I don't think I'm gonna do this anymore. Maybe this is going to lead me to pain and disappointment, like we talked about last week. And so you decide to opt out of some of those things. And maybe they come up to you and they're like, hey, let's go, Saturday night, we're gonna go out, we're gonna do that thing, we're gonna go worship the devil on Saturday night together in the backyard. And so you're invited to do this. Do you need to come down with them and let them know, no way, how dare you? What you're doing is sinful and ungodly. You can simply say, that's not for me. No thanks. It's not my scene. Not my cup of tea. What you do, though, that's not my business. What business is it of mine? Now, if they come to you in a safe setting and say, hey, I want to understand, what's the reasoning behind it? Why did you decide not to do this anymore? That's different. Then you can unpack and explain, well, honestly, this is where I believe that this road leads, and so I've decided not to be part of it. But what business is it of ours, if you're a follower of Jesus, Paul would say, to judge the world? None. None. Let me put it this way. If there are people in your life, people in your family, who don't believe what you believe, friends that you have who don't believe what you believe, they should like you more because of your faith, not less. If what you believe means you are living and leading, like we talked about a few weeks ago, with love, seeking their good for their sake, wanting what's best for them, that's an attractive thing. But for some reason, often it's with the best of intentions, you'll come to a place where maybe you start to believe something and then feel like you've got to let everybody else know. We've got to let everyone, we're not okay with that, now this has changed. And really, we're skipping the whole process that's been explained in other places. It starts with a relationship, knowing, and then trust develops, and then you start to listen to someone. But if you address someone's behavior at step one, you've skipped the whole process. Now, there's another side to this. And Jesus actually explained this pretty early on, right? If last week what we talked about was true, that often where this stuff leads is to pain and disappointment, then sometimes the loving thing to do is to address the behavior of someone else, if it really does lead to pain and disappointment. But Jesus explains this and gives us some guidelines for how and when to do this. And here's what he says. You might be familiar with this passage. He's talking to his closest followers here. He says, so why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye. He's using hyperbole. He's exaggerating. He's like, your brother has a speck of sawdust, and you got a 2x4, like a piece of wood in your own eye, and you pay no attention to it. He says, how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? And then he uses this word you might be familiar with. He says, you hypocrite. Look at that. Isn't that ironic? Jesus uses that word. First, take the plank out of your eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So he gives some guidelines here, and it's important to understand these guidelines, and it makes sense, right? Like if really this stuff can lead to pain and disappointment, then really out of concern for one another, there does need to be a way of addressing it. But it doesn't need to feel like we're dropping a hammer on someone. And so the first question you ask is who? If you're considering doing this, the question you ask is who, meaning what's our relationship like? Are they with their faith where I am with my faith? Jesus uses the word brother or sister. That's an implication there. What he's saying is not like you're in the same household. He's saying you're operating under the same beliefs. You both believe that God is for you, in your corner. You both have the same beliefs about this kind of stuff. So on level ground, you bring it up, right? So the first question is who? The second question is why? What's the point? Why am I bringing this up? Is it because there's this sense of like satisfaction in pointing out where you're wrong? Or is it genuinely for the good of the other? Paul would say later on, let all that you do be done in love. Like this too. Speaking the truth in love. Like sometimes it's necessary to say the hard thing, but it needs to be done in love for the good of the other, with the goal of removing the speck. The next question is when? When do you do it? Jesus says, first, take the plank out of your own eye. Like, do it after you check yourself out. Do you know why? And really what he says here is profound. He's talking about wood, a tiny piece of wood and a gigantic piece of wood, right? The brother has the tiny piece of wood and I've got the huge piece of wood. We tend to notice most clearly in other people what we hate most about in ourselves. And so Jesus is saying, like, make sure this issue is not a you issue. Like, it's really on that side. And it's not something that you're dealing with that you are then projecting onto them. And so go first. And this is true especially in relationships, especially at home with the people you're close with. Right? When there's an issue, usually the issue is not like 100% fault and 0% fault. Usually there's some broken up percentage there. He's saying deal with your percentage first, even if it's 5%, because that's a 5% you can control. So deal with that and then move forward. And lastly, he says how? How? And this is where I think this illustration is just like brilliant. How do you do it? How do you address someone's behavior? The same exact way you would do it if you were wiping something out of their eye. You wouldn't do it on the run. You wouldn't do it carelessly. You wouldn't do it to somebody who doesn't trust you. You wouldn't do it when you're angry. You wouldn't do it in the middle of an argument. You wouldn't do it casually. You wouldn't do it without their attention, right? You'd make sure they were sitting down and ready for you to make a move because you're about to go into a really sensitive area. And maybe then you'll be able to remove the speck. And the finished product is clarity. It's relief. It shouldn't feel like you've just been judged, Like right before this passage, what Jesus says is, don't judge, or you too will be judged. Like if you're judging other people, just like going around with the hammer, people are going to come after you with their hammer. And then he goes into addressing other people's behavior. In other words, it shouldn't feel like it was a judgment. It should feel like, hey, hold on, like you've got something. Let me help you. It's done out of concern for them. But these are people that know you, that trust you, and are operating under the same beliefs that you're operating under. They understand. You have the same foundation, and so there's a mutual understanding there that you're on the same page. But it's not our responsibility. If you're a follower of Jesus, it is not your responsibility to police the behavior of the rest of the world. Our job is to be for people. The Apostle Paul said in one of his other letters that you should make the teachings of God attractive in your life and lead your relationships with love. There should be something about you that is drawing people to you as they are, where they are, not pushing them away from you. This is what Jesus meant when he talked about being the light of the world. There's something appealing, the salt of the earth, the kind of people that give this place flavor. That's what salt does. He's like, there's something good, attractive. And yet this whole idea, and sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes it's done with the best of intentions. It's done by people who think that they're doing the right thing. The church goes around policing the world, and it just pushes people away instead of drawing them in. And so that's the idea. Really, as a whole, if we step back and look at this series, that's the idea behind all the things. They're given to you, they're given to us for our good, because God cares deeply for us. They're summed up in this idea of love, and they're given to prevent us from pain and disappointment. But they're built on this relationship, which means it's not the church's job to go police the behavior of other people who don't have that kind of trust in a relationship with God. Now, I don't know about you, but I think as a whole, if we as a church get that, I don't know how we arrive at earning the reputation of being judgmental hypocrites. I don't know. When the church first started, when Jesus first left, the people on the inside lived like a way of life that was irresistible. It gave people on the outside a vision of what life could be, and so they were drawn to it. It's why it grew so rapidly. People weren't guilted into it. No one's arm was twisted into it. It was something that people wanted. What if we got back there? What if, like here in our lives, people liked us, if you were a follower of Jesus, because of what you believe? Not in spite of it. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. We're out of time, but here's what I'll leave you with. I told you the story, if you were here, about a year ago, but it's one of those stories that just will stick with me forever. There was this girl, a tour guide in China. She grew up in China. And in China, it's not so easy to practice your faith. It's not super easy to be a follower of Jesus. And so for her, when she came to believe, she wasn't also handed all of the cultural baggage that some of us were when we first heard about the church. She read the teachings of Jesus. She understood the role of the rules in context. And she decided to practice her faith in China, even though in some situations it put her life at risk. And so one day she had an opportunity to meet a pastor from the US. She was giving him a tour, And at the end of a tour, this group of people, they were given the opportunity to ask questions. And this tour guide, like the girl, had the opportunity to ask a question. And she turned and asked the pastor who was actually on the tour. She said, "Are you a pastor in the U.S.?" He said, "Yes." And this was our question. Understanding the role of all the things, her question was, why doesn't everybody go to church? Like, why wouldn't everyone want that? To believe in a God who is for them, who gives them a way of life that will lead to flourishing and who works to protect them from pain and disappointment. Why wouldn't anyone want that? What if we were able to like make a dent in the reputation of the church, even just right here in our community? What if we were known for being people who believe that God was for us? What if we lived lives that were for those in our community? We show that same kind of advocacy toward people in our community. Could you imagine the change that it could bring, even just for the small circles that we function in? What if we made the teachings about God attractive? It comes back to understanding the role of all the things.